Well, this game didn't age well.
I bet you heard people say this exact combination of words on Reddit, Twitter, in forums, etc. Hell, maybe you yourself said it in the past about a game or multiple games. Well, I'm here to tell you that this line of thinking just doesn't make much sense in my opinion. Games do not age. Look at this game. What do you see? Do you like what you see? Do you know how old this game is? If this was sold on the Nintendo Switch online store, would you be interested in it? How about this game? What do you think? Is this a game that looks good? Both graphically, in terms of gameplay? And again, would you be interested in it if you saw it on the current console's online store? How about this one? Same question as before. Or this one. Or this one. Of course, many people watching this will be familiar with one, two, or even all of the games you just saw. But for those who are not familiar with them, did you see a significant difference? 3 of these are more than 20 years old, and 2 of these less than 10 years. I would argue none of them is significantly better or worse than the others, and I would certainly say that there was no aging happening here. All of these control well, look good, and are well designed. So, my argument ultimately boils down to the following. This game aged badly is in reality simply saying that this game was always bad, we just didn't have much to compare it to at the time. If you only ever played bad video games, and you don't have good games to compare them to, you might be content with playing the bad games. Well, until you are exposed to the good ones more and more. One good one might be seen by you as a standout title at first. A game that is way better than those other games that you still like at the moment. Then the second good game crosses your way, and you got another standout title that those other games you liked so far pale in comparison to. Then a third game comes along, and a fourth, and a fifth, the 20th. At some point you will look back at those bad games you played from before you were exposed to all those good games and say,
Well, this didn't age well.
but that's just not what happened. Nothing aged. Your horizon simply widens to the world of actually well-designed and well-made games. And nothing shows this better than the SNES era of games, where somehow most of the titles people now say didn't age well are suspiciously mostly games made in North America and some made in Europe. What you almost never see is someone saying this about games made by premium Japanese developers of the time, like Capcom, Konami, and Nintendo. You can pick nearly any SNES, Mega Drive, and PC Engine game by these 3 publishers at random and be reasonably sure that the game you picked will be anywhere from good to amazing. Mega Man X. A game with great controls, great graphics, amazing level design, a great soundtrack, it's the full package. Castlevania Rondo of Blood. Again, crisp controls, great graphics, amazing level design, the soundtrack is great. Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island. Phenomenal graphics, great gameplay, great level design, great soundtrack, great use of the Super FX2 chip. You could release any of these 3 games today and they wouldn't be out of place between pixel art indie titles of today. In fact, so many of those are directly inspired and even copy elements of these games to a great degree, precisely because they are so good. Shovel Knight is directly influenced by games like Capcom's Mega Man, Capcom's DuckTales, Konami's Castlevania 3, and Nintendo's Super Mario Bros. 3. If games aging was a thing, how come these games haven't aged? There's nothing about them, how they were made, the technology they use, that was in any way special compared to the ones that supposedly aged badly. They were on the same systems, Capcom didn't have an inherent advantage over Virgin Interactive or LJN. Yet this Capcom-developed Aladdin game plays way better than this Virgin Interactive-developed Aladdin game. Both released in the same exact year, even the same month. The Capcom game has precise controls and good level design. The Virgin Interactive game has spongy controls and bad level design, riddled with annoyingly placed enemies and even blind jumps, which is a big no-no when it comes to jump and run level design. It's really hard to describe how bad this feels to play. The jumping is good enough, I think, but the combat is horrible. Your attack animations feel awful and unresponsive. And sometimes it's really hard to even see that you're attacking. When you jump and attack at the same time, the animation is so weird that you barely see that you hit something. And of course, there are the blind jumps I was talking about. Down there are spikes, which I cannot see, even if I move the camera down by holding the D-pad down. I cannot see the spikes down there. If I jump down in the wrong angle, I will get hit. And I was not able to predict this. This is unfair and bad level design. And I have to go here, this is not some hidden secret place. Meanwhile, the Super Nintendo version is way better. You will need a bit of time to get used to it, but the gameplay is way more imaginative and way more close to the source material. Aladdin doesn't have a sword, and so he doesn't have a sword here either. You throw apples, or you jump on enemies and vault over them. Basically, you are using parkour to defeat your enemies, and you're using parkour to beat the levels. You swing, you vault across poles. The gameplay in general is just way more interesting than just jumping and hitting people with swords. They used Aladdin's character in the movie as an inspiration for the gameplay, which I cannot say for the Mega Drive version, where they just turned it into a run-of-the-mill, hit people with sword 2D jump and run. But Virgin's Aladdin didn't age badly. It was always bad compared to the Capcom Aladdin. And it was always bad compared to most of Capcom's, Konami, Sunsoft's or Nintendo's games. But if you were a kid in the 90s and your parents bought you a Mega Drive and you got this game, you didn't have 200 games to compare it to. You didn't have access to YouTube or Reddit to discuss games, compare them, talk about what makes them good and others bad. You just had the games you had, and if they weren't completely unplayably bad, odds are you loved them. And even game reviewers didn't have the amount of comparison points they have today. Reviewing games as a job was in its infancy, and access to games to review was way more limited than today. The fewer points of comparison you have, the worse your ability to actually judge the quality of any of those points of data. Is this game good or bad?
Well, I don't really like it, but maybe I just don't like video games in general. Those other two games I played I also didn't like, but this one is better than those other two, so I would say it's good, I guess?
As you and as the industry grows older, more and more good games become known to you and the general video game consuming public. Your points of comparison increase, making the bad ones stand out more. An issue you were willing to ignore before, like unfair level design or bad and imprecise controls, are suddenly not ignorable to you anymore. Suddenly, you do know how good games feel and control. Suddenly, you know how fun and good level design can be, how good art design can be, how good music in games can be. Suddenly, it's really hard to ignore how stupid early Sierra games were designed, where you could overlook a tiny pixel in the beginning of the game and then be locked from progressing hours later in the game, forcing you to completely restart the game. In Space Quest, if you do not read this data disk, you will not be able to enter a password at the very end of the game. You find this data disk at the very beginning of the game, by the way, and after a certain point you will not be able to go back to it either. This is called a soft lock, a design element of a game that gets you stuck without any way to progress, which is textbook bad game design. And that's not even the only soft lock of that game. And that's only one game. Some of them were changed in later re-releases at least, but this is an issue that Lucasfilm games, aka LucasArts games, never really had. So they are way more playable from a modern perspective than those early Sierra games. But not because they aged better, no, because early Sierra games were badly designed games, plain and simple, while LucasArts/Lucasfilm games were way better designed. Not saying they were perfect, but absolutely better than Sierra. And it's not like it was only super early Sierra games either. Even the 5th King's Quest game has ways to softlock your progress. The 5th game in a series, and they had multiple long-running series of games besides King's Quest, many of which had softlocks in the first games, their second games, even the 4th and 5th games. But back in the day, Sierra games were beloved by many because they didn't have as many points of reference, and they just ignored all the bad design choices by the developers as the novelty of the genre was still there. It was still somewhat fresh and exciting, even if you played the not so well designed examples of the genre. But you might now say,
how come that we still have games that are now labeled as badly aged well into the 2000s?
Yes, that seems weird at first, since you would assume by the 2000s the gaming landscape has evolved and ripened enough for people to instantly spot badly made games, and not be blinded by novelty and a lack of choices anymore, right? Well, that would have been true if games stayed two-dimensional, but they didn't. With the advent of 3D gaming, an entirely new kind of novelty came along. It was like a reset button for the expectations of gamers. Gamers didn't know how 3D games are supposed to be made. They didn't know if 3D controls could be as good as Mario 64 in all games. The cycle basically started anew. If there are only a handful of 3D platformers on the market, who is to say how good they can feel to play or how good the level design can be? Even Mario 64, a game still seen as one of the best in the genre, clearly had growing pains. It has many issues with its engine and physics because 3D gaming was a steep climb to take for game developers. The fact that Mario 64 is as good as it is an absolute miracle. So is it any wonder that people lowered their expectations for 3D at first, accepted mediocrity for quite some time, and now are looking back at this mediocrity and feel different about these games from their modern point of view? No, it's pretty much expected, I think. Even controllers were at a state of big uncertainty at the time. Sony changed its controller design twice during the PS1 generation. Sega changed its design once, just to keep up with what 3D games needed in order to play well. But because the default controller was still one without analog sticks and only a D-pad, this had knock-on effects on how games played. Spyro the Dragon, for example, has very sluggish controls, because the developers had to smooth over the sudden direction changes a D-pad will give you. They smoothed out the directional changes by making Spyro turn more sluggishly. And yes, Spyro supports analog controls, but because the D-pad had to be treated as the default way to play PS1 games, the character movement was completely optimized for that, making analog controls still feel sluggish due to that baggage. Meanwhile, Mario felt very crisp and precise to control, because every N64 controller had a stick, and so the full capabilities of the stick could be used. 3D also added so much complexity that many developers pushed the hardware way too hard. You gotta remember, SNES and NES games for the most part were nearly all 60 FPS games. There were the odd 30 FPS title here and there, but 60 FPS was the default. On N64 and PS1, that changed, because ambitions of developers outpaced the capabilities of the hardware. So in these early 3D times, aging badly is also often something said about games like GoldenEye and Perfect Dark. Not because of the gameplay, but because the performance on original hardware is abysmal. Perfect Dark could drop below 10 FPS, and even still well-liked games today like Ocarina of Time ran at 20 FPS. and that's if you lived in Japan or America. In the PAL region, this is reduced to an eye-watering 17 frames per second. So I think you see how it is no wonder that early 3D also created many "this didn't age well" opinions. Developers had to adjust to the new technology, and gamers had to adjust to the expectations of what 3D gaming means for the design and feel of games.
But this also happened on PlayStation 2.
Yes, it did. But on PS2, it was once again more of a Japan versus rest of the world. Devil May Cry 3 on PlayStation 2 has a better combat system, better controls, a better frame rate, and all in all is a better game than DMC, which released 8 years later and a full console generation later. So once again, we are at a point where some developers simply knew how to make good games, and some didn't. But it wasn't as cut and dry as it was on the SNES and before. Western developers finally started to become competitive, and the ones who did release games that are timeless, the SSX series for example, or Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2X, now free from its limitations of the 5th generation consoles, are still amazing today. And there is evidence for that being true. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1+2 released only a few years ago. Its gameplay based on the level design of THPS 1 and 2, hence the name, and the controls and possibilities of THPS 4, with very little adjustments, if any. And it was extremely well received, so clearly the age of the gameplay, which in this case was at least 18 years old, if we use THPS 4 as a comparison point, had not a single sign of aging. Weird, isn't it? Almost as if it was always good, and will always be good. Devil May Cry 3 will always be good. Maximo will always be good. Metal Gear Solid 2 will always be good. Need for Speed Underground 2 will always be good. Resident Evil 4 will always be good. There's a reason this game was ported to every piece of hardware, das nicht bei drei auf dem Baum war, as we would say in Germany. The Xbox 360 and PS3 generation with their jump to HD graphics sadly went through a similar situation as the PS1 and N64 generation. Many developers overdid it, resulting in awful performance, which many now call badly aged. But it isn't badly aged, it was just badly optimized for the hardware. But people just put up with it because HD, 720p, it was the new hotness. They were blinded by the pixel density and the shiny new flat panel TVs. And now looking back, this blindness is gone, and the reality settled in. These games played like shit, and often looked like shit. They always did. Even the TVs at the time, new and shiny at first, are now looked back at as being among the worst era of TV technology ever. HD-ready TVs were often an extreme downgrade from old tube TVs. If you switch from a top-of-the-line Sony Trinitron to a Sony Bravia flat-panel TV, you downgraded. It wasn't an upgrade at all. Image quality took a nosedive. Input lag increased massively. Black levels were non-existent. Motion clarity was horrendous. But it was new and shiny and flat, and the screen sizes 40 inches. Yes, even I was among the ones blinded by this. I begged my mom to get a 40-inch Samsung 768p HD-ready TV to go with my Xbox 360. And at the time, I was floored by the screen size and HD image. Looking back, I now see how stupid I was. We had a really good PAL 60 compatible CRT, a decently big one as well. That thing was so much better than that Samsung HD TV. So you see, this doesn't only happen with games. Something new comes along, and you get blinded by the newness and the lack of comparison and experience. I was a dumb teenager, wanting the new thing, not thinking about if it was the right choice. I turned that very HD-ready TV back on just a few months ago, when my current OLED had an issue and needed a repair. So using that old Samsung again really put into perspective how awful it was, It was one of the best TVs of its time as well. It had the lowest input latency of any TV at the time, and had low pixel response times as well compared to its contemporaries. But it was horrendous compared to the best CRTs at the time. Games, just like that TV, don't age badly or age well. They are bad or good the moment they release. If a developer uses the hardware they release on well, optimize the game to run well, control well, look good, sound good, and if they design it well, their game is good and will always be good. 5, 10, 20, hell even 50 years later. If they don't know how to use the hardware well, if they don't know how to make their characters feel good to control, how to design fun levels and obstacles, if they don't know how to make a game look appealing, then maybe they can ride on a wave of novelty for a while. But ultimately, their games will be seen as what they always were. Bad games. Of course, there will also always be the type of people that will look at Resident Evil 4 and cry about the tank controls being outdated, but those are just casual plebs. Tank controls are fine if the game is designed well around them, which Resident Evil 4 is, as is Resident Evil Remake, and God Hand, and Metroid Prime. It's fine if you don't like tank controls, but stop saying they are outdated. They simply are not. You can of course argue that this is all just semantics, but good design simply doesn't age. It will always be good. And with that, thank you for watching. Subscribe, like, and play some good retro games. Play Vice Project Doom or Higane. Don't be shocked by their difficulty though. Bye.